So, as I'm sure some of you will remember, I made a pair of videos related to American Horror Story Apocalypse, one of which advised showrunner Ryan Murphy on what to do and what not to do, the other of which looked at what was more likely to happen because, let's face it, he wasn't going to follow my advice anyway. Most of what I said was likely to happen did actually happen. You're welcome. There were some things that it avoided, and I'm glad of that, but the ones that happened were pretty terrible. I will say that Apocalypse was far better than Cult, but then any other season was, and better than Roanoke, though it frankly felt hotel-like in its level of almost but not quite. By that I mean the first few seasons of the show set a tone that Hotel fumbled with, last-minute miscast roles to replace missing actors, hasty rewrites, and incoherent plot that came secondary to its inconsistent aesthetic. Hotel tried to recapture the earlier seasons with a bunch of callbacks, which frankly made it and the earlier seasons look worse for the connections, and simultaneously do its own thing to advance the story and setting, which should have never been unified as a singular world. So this time I'm going to look at ways that Apocalypse fell short of what it could have and should have been, as well as explaining some things that people seem not to have understood about it. I give you 13 problem points on American Horror Story Apocalypse. 1. Bad storytelling. Apocalypse started off with a titular event. No, seriously, like 5 minutes in, it's all over. I get why it was done this way. They wanted to keep the viewers tuning in as long as they could by keeping the witches out of it until almost halfway through the series. But they kept the witches out of it until almost halfway through the series. The witches are consistently the most popular American Horror Story characters, and a return had been teased literally every season since Coven. It's understandable that they doubted their writing ability to keep viewers' attention, but everything they did consistently was the wrong thing to do. It's especially worth noting that the characters we followed for the first few episodes all died in an incredibly inane way, making those episodes not only pointless, but a completely unnecessary slog. It's also worth mentioning that Coco, who was written clearly to be the butt of a joke and a foolish, incompetent character, was the only one consistently correct and consistently willing to speak the truth about the situation that everyone else constantly wasted our time with. Coco was amusing, but she was also depressing because here was the only person worth listening to, and she was basically presented by the narrative as the village idiot. No one took her seriously, but much like they had done with Madison in Coven, Coco was the one who was consistently correct and reasonable, even when she was being unreasonable. The situation was patently ludicrous, and she didn't hesitate to call bullshit on Venable and her troop of personnel all with a stick up their asses. They started off with the end of the world. Great. So there goes any possible tension that could have been built. When it's over and done with, and the world's through, there's not a whole lot that the audience can hope for. Especially after we saw the rest of the story, there's no legitimate reason this couldn't have happened at, say, episode 6, thereby making it tragic and horrific. Actual horror in American Horror Story, miracle I know, and giving them enough time to just take things in linear fashion, which is what they should have done from the beginning. Most of the series' storytelling was in flashbacks, and that's way too much flashback. It's generally, and rightly, regarded as a poor storytelling technique when something is so dependent on flashbacks. A lot of the time you get your audience thinking, right, but what's happening now? They want to see events progress, which they can't do in a flashback. You also have limited tension available to you in a flashback because the audience sees who's there telling the story and can usually assume correctly about how it goes. If we'd started off the series at Miss Robichaud's Academy before the missiles and slowly unfolded the intrigue and machinations behind the scenes, perhaps only revealing Michael's true nature around the 3rd or 4th episode, it would have built so much more tension and avoided all that terrible flashing back. The witches would have far greater investment in what they're doing, and the stakes would be higher to stop something truly terrible from happening. It would have been very high stakes indeed after we'd see Michael and his minions take out so many of the witches, and the survivors would have to struggle to survive. The stereotypical scenario of the heroes having to save the world would at least seem more believable with the witches thrust into the responsibility without really choosing it. It's just that no one else could do the job. It's not like they set out to beat the bad guy or anything. And they're flawed characters, so they give a realistic quality to their roles in the story. Because that's another problem with the writing. Nothing is even hinted at in Coven that the witches are going to factor in at all in the battle against the Antichrist, yet everyone acts like it should have been expected. A huge part of Michael's plans involves taking out the descendants of Salem, the people that can use magic, whatever they call themselves. The power of the Supreme supposedly is enough to challenge Michael, But is it? And if so, shouldn't have this come up long before now, say in Murder House, where it was a major plot point that this prophecy of the Antichrist? I mean, if they were aware of this, even as old folk belief that no one really pays much attention to, then shouldn't there have been some awareness spread of it to neophyte Zoe and Coven? You'd think someone would have mentioned, in all their searching for a supreme, that the position carries a responsibility with it to oppose the inevitable emergence of the Antichrist. And it's not like there aren't signs of the Antichrist coming to power, so that's no excuse. Cordelia just got a vision out of nowhere herself. 2 unanswered questions. It's been said that there are no stupid questions, but that's a load. Obviously, there are plenty of questions that are patently asinine in the asking. I'm not here to cast shade on those, but I'm also not here to answer them. There are plenty of things that are obvious enough in the series that somehow people just aren't noticing, so I'll address a couple of things that I felt were maybe a little obscured, mainly by bad or inconsistent writing. The Rubber Man is Michael. It's basically said that Tate wasn't evil, it was the spirit of Michael in him who wanted to be born through him, which is total bullshit and completely demolishes the first season in less than a single episode, but I won't get into that again. Tate, as a ghost in American Horror Story, cannot leave the place where he died except on Halloween night. It's something that has more than adequately been established with the series. So we know that, unless this shelter was built underneath the murder house, which it wasn't, Tate could not be the Rubber Man. But Michael also makes a big deal out of not being sexually interested at all, which is a problem considering who and what the Antichrist is supposed to be. Of course he's sexual, and of course he's going to be a real deviant. Gallant is the most sexually oriented and kinkiest person there. It's established, and he makes his feelings clearly known. The Rubber Man, if we're to take the show at face value, represents Michael's sexual side. It's pure raw sex given form, previously through Tate, who was highly sexual and pretty kinky. The Rubber Man doesn't show up again once Michael has other things to occupy his time and attention. He has to focus on the immediate threat to him, so Rubber Man can't come out to play again. He disappears from the narrative, which I do think was a mistake, and could have been developed more, but it at least is pretty easy to put the pieces together. Michael had no further opportunity to express his sexual side, which he kept repressed and shut back at all times. It's completely understandable, and very realistic, that such a character would need an outlet. On the topic of Michael, though, I think we should just mention here that Cody Fern is not meant to be an actor. He can be a model, and he's even pretty when he's paired with an able photographer, but he's not really an actor. Yet, like Gaga in Hotel, he's given huge swaths of dialogue and complex scenes of acting that are way far beyond anything he can possibly do at this point. Like a lot of the actors in American Horror Story, he has a certain range and probably might be able to do well in it. However, Apocalypse never has a single scene in his range, so he comes off as being one of the worst actors in the world, and he's supposed to be one of the most central pivotal characters of the whole series. Bravo! Michael is supposed to be the adversary with a capital A, which coincidentally is also the first letter of Antichrist, and yet all he comes off as is another word that begins with A, which is asshole. Yes, he's a serial killer and a psychopath, but it's acted so poorly that we never take him seriously. He's just a douche with superpowers, who acts like that one guy in every goth community. You know the one. If you didn't before, you know now. And last but not least, that wig is hideous, and there's zero reason for it to exist except to be a lazy way of showing that time's passed for stupid viewers. Number 3. Witchcraft. There's a bit of discussion about it, and it's a motivating force for several characters, but the claim that witches are superior to warlocks is frankly asinine and comes off like a hokey bullshit habit. By that I mean that it's something people assume and keep saying, but people only regard it as true because people keep saying it. It's like old wives' tales, and it's never really examined at all. No one questions whether or not it's really true, and to be honest, it seems completely false. All of the warlocks at the Hawthorne School exhibit appreciably, palpably stronger and more varied powers than anyone but Fiona showed in the entire run of Coven. Sexism is a problem, and yes, sexism is when you treat someone less well than someone else because of their biological sex. Men do it, women do it, other people do it, everyone can do it, and it's in full force here. It's always especially annoying to me when people like Ryan Murphy do it, and when shows like American Horror Story do it, because most of the time they're not good enough to make the statement that they want to make. Oftentimes it's a situation where they'd like to be all girl power and love to harp on the legendary strong female character. I could discuss this at length, but it's something that really deserves at least its own focus. Honestly, you could write volumes upon volumes about it, and that's not what I'm here to talk about today. What I will say, though, is that a lot of times these attempts end up doing the exact opposite of what they set out to do. Apocalypse, like Coven before it, doesn't really make a strong case for girl power, certainly not any measure of equality, and the only empowering here is literal magic powers. If anything, Apocalypse is less empowering than Coven was. Just making a character able to hit harder than another one isn't enough. The capacity for physical violence is not enough. In the tarot, the strength card is typically a beautiful woman cradling a lion in her arms, having tamed the king of the beasts with an inner strength, not with physical dominion. And that's kind of what I think a lot of people miss when they try to write strong characters. Being able to beat somebody up or having one over on them does not make a person strong. The ability to kick ass is not necessarily the mark of a strong person. Being able to make the right choice in a difficult situation, having clever responses when challenged, and being able to intelligently apply the strengths you have are all better gauges of the quality of someone. It's unfortunate that people so often tend to assume that a kind of raw power equals strength. The reality of the situation couldn't be more different. If you have a massive physical advantage over someone, it could be argued that instead you're a lot weaker because you have that obvious advantage and are holding it over someone else. You don't have to make difficult decisions when you can just beat them down. But returning to Apocalypse, the series consistently sets up women for disaster. It's amazing that they didn't catch any of this in pre-production because it's pretty blatant. Time and again, it's the women in Apocalypse who are the worst of the worst, the most utterly irredeemable, and they constantly build up their own. Michael isn't really even a man. He's not really a male character at all, he's just a placeholder. He's a cardboard cutout who fills a perfunctory role, but even if he's the cackling bad guy, it's people like Mead, Venable, and even Cordelia who are really the villains of the piece. Cordelia is especially bad, even coming across as a bully, with the power she clearly doesn't deserve and wasn't ready for. Fiona, for all of her flaws, knew what she was getting into and was ready for the power. She's a much stronger character, but part of that is, too, the natural charisma of the actress. Sarah Paulson's personal charm can't come through on a character not only unsuited to her, but outside of her range. Jessica Lange managed to make Fiona compelling, a pivotal character of the season, and Cordelia never got there. It's really telling when you look at the parallels in the two seasons. When Fiona clashed with Myrtle, we were delighted by both of them and all the things going on around them. Even though Myrtle was dead set against Fiona, she was still a wonderful character we loved to see and couldn't get enough of. And even though Fiona was a real bitch sometimes, she was the kind of bitch we liked to see. Cordelia, on the other hand, is threatened when someone is open or vocal about their dislike of her, and she refuses to accept any criticism whatsoever without literally threatening the person's life. Fiona may have manhandled people who crossed her, but the only time she did something as outrageous as Delia was an instance of remarkably bad writing that wasn't really even in character. Even if we accept that as part of events, Fiona still has a lot less blood on her hands than Delia. Even if we only look at how Cordelia failed in Apocalypse, she's still guilty of so much worse than Fiona ever was. The witches essentially created their own problem. They are directly to blame for virtually everything that happens. Cordelia, despite having the opportunity to fix things when she decided to go public with witches, has wasted that opportunity. She still segregates students by sex, after having been married to a witch murderer and first-hand witnessing how dangerous it is in the world for anyone with magic abilities. She also still holds to the assumption that women are superior to men in magic, which directly contributes to several people working against her and ultimately the compromising of what could have been allies. The Hawthorne School is turned into a bomb shelter by the cooperative directly due to the fact that Cordelia couldn't get her head out of her ass long enough to at least pay lip service to the concept of equality. That would have at the very least made it much more difficult for any conspiracy against her to work. But by acting as she did, a boorish, toxic bully who tries to intimidate with the threat of violence, she galvanized all opposition against her and showed very ably that she is not kind at all, making the claim that she wears a kind facade quite a suspect one. Let's be honest, it was just Poor script writing that was counting on the actors to sell something that wasn't in the script at all. Cordelia has never been written as a nice person. She always makes everything about her and always has to have a pity party with her as the guest of honor whenever anything happens. No matter what it is, no matter who else suffers or dies, Delia expects everyone to focus on her. No wonder she's popular with self-important teenagers. She's practically the embodiment of the diva adolescent who can't control their sharp mood swings and demands that the world rotate around their life. But back with the world building of Apocalypse, it's an interesting enough idea that the alpha warlock could be more powerful than the supreme witch, and that otherwise warlocks tend to be less powerful. But again, even if it were not shown to be true, which it is not, it's something that could have been avoided simply by not being a childish asshole to everyone, Delia. What happened to being a better supreme than Fiona? Because you have yet to do anything better than Fiona. Fiona was a character with a strong appeal despite the fact that she wouldn't hesitate to steamroll people's minds or kill them outright, despite her doing all kinds of drugs, despite her not taking her responsibility as Supreme very seriously for years. Despite all that, Fiona was a better Supreme than Cordelia ever manages. She was called a scared, pathetic girl, and you know what? She acts like it. Her "because I'm the fucking Supreme" line comes off as appropriately as a tween throwing a tantrum. Even her last words, which we can imagine the character chose carefully, were laughably stupid and carried absolutely zero weight. Could we not, at least, have had some line really sticking it to Michael and giving a good one for her fallen allies? If you want to have a character come off as a heroic figure, or even just as a sympathetic one, try not to have them be a bigot who refuses to progress beyond unexamined traditions that very obviously cause serious problems. It does wonders when a character who's supposed to be nice and immediately beloved by people she meets actually acts like someone lovable and understanding. I could make a comedy edit with all of Delia's obnoxious outbursts and little bitch fits, and that does not make for a very sympathetic lead. The thing is, it doesn't have to be like real life, where witches are witches no matter their sex or gender, and one isn't more important or better at magic than others. But if you're going to introduce a complicated sexist standard, at least have the decency to give it something the audience can think about. No one is inclined to take any character's claims at face value, and this is why show don't tell is a very valuable piece of advice. They say one thing, but they show something completely different. And sure, maybe they meant some of that. But this is Ryan Murphy, so I'm just going to assume that the writing was probably accidental or incidental, and in fact it was just a case of sloppy, shoddy plotting. He totally intended for everyone to take a fundamentally sexist and frankly stupid system at face value, and then he just added a bunch of scenes that look cool without thinking about how they added to, or as the case may be, took away from, the story and the world he was building. 4. The fun in Dysfunctional. I'm just going to go ahead and say it. The characters never liked each other. Virtually everyone from Coven disliked each other to some degree, and there's this weird assumed sense of them being irrationally fond of each other in Apocalypse. Why? Few characters are established as being on friendly terms, like Myrtle and Bubbles, but Bubbles is woefully underused, exactly as I predicted in my Lowered Expectations video, and the rest of the Coven can barely tolerate each other most of the time. Most characters have one friend. One. That's it. And these interpersonal relationships are rarely ever touched on or even allowed to be acknowledged. Yet there's this lazy, undeserved, unearned assumption that they're basically cool with each other and all the problematic crap they're complicit in. Yeah, sure, but far be it from American Horror Story to actually dedicate any time to the Coven coming together in a crisis believably. No, instead they've got to waste hours of our time with characters who ultimately amount to absolutely nothing in the setting of the story, most of whom never even meet the actual protagonist of the piece. Spectacular! And worst of all of them is, of course, Delia, who is now sporting her mother's surname rather than the one that sounds like a very sad stripper. We're supposed to believe she's still focused enough to try gathering the genuinely terrible students from way back when, because she's so invested emotionally in their success. Excuse you. Where was that concern when they were, students? And when, more than half of them were actually alive? The thing is, I actually remember Coven. And no, you're never living down the massive bullshit I will always and forever call on how you screwed Madison over and tried to make her seem like the worst thing ever because she was going to go public with witches. And then Delia went public with witches and it was supposed to be seen as amazing and positive. Yeah, bravo, bitch. There's no legitimate reason Madison should ever work with Cordelia, much less eagerly do so. But we couldn't have complexity in it even though Cordelia did nothing to help Madison and even indirectly caused her death, or at least never bothered trying to bring her back. Just as we couldn't have anyone who doesn't join the Cordelia love-in. I could maybe take Delia more seriously as a kind person if she weren't constantly spouting hate. Or when she's not doing that, she's either being completely ineffectual or she's pitching some childish fit that makes it clear how much she's overcompensating. She sucks, basically, is what I'm trying to say, and she's aware of this fact. And like I said before, maybe Brian Murphy intended this with his writing, but as he's not known for his nuance and subtlety, I'm just going to assume, probably correctly, that he didn't consider what a massive asshole she comes off as at any given moment. And you know it's not intended because all the dialogue keeps pointing to what a kind, warm person Cordelia is, and how people just want to be with her and do things for her. Yeah, right! She erases people's mouths instead of actually letting them defend themselves, then taunts them. You said my power is waning? Yeah, because it fucking is. Witches don't generally show supreme potential unless and until the current supreme is on her way out. So it was more than reasonable that they would assume that's happening now. And yeah, maybe they were plotting against her. Maybe they were planning something that would put them in control because they'd been treated poorly and their supposed leader was doing nothing to address their concerns. Maybe, I don't know, like Fiona, which was why Delia constantly complained about her. It's very hard to like a massive hypocrite that characters look stupid for celebrating, but especially when she's very much a worse person than Fiona Good, who, as much as I liked her, would not hesitate to cut down her enemies. But even Fiona at her worst never erased another person's mouth. She didn't even cut out Spaulding's tongue. He did it himself because of his dedication to her. So there's one major way in which Cordelia is, despite being presumably a more active Supreme, worse than Fiona, who I should point out, did more for the Coven and witches everywhere in a couple of months than Delia has managed to do in literally years. I should also point out that Cordelia being so scandalized at people plotting to take a superior position she currently occupies just adds to the massive amount of hypocrisy she embodies. There's just a small thing, tiny little point really, of her doing the exact same thing to her mother. She plotted for months to overthrow Fiona, and she even literally attempted murder of her own mother multiple times and conspired with the other witches in her attempt to accomplish this goal. She involved more people in a period of a witch-hunting crisis in which she was complicit, and had the audacity to take exception at other people ever pointing out that she might not be the best choice for the role of Supreme, which she also wasn't intended to be at the beginning of Coven. It's clear as a bell that it was an 11th hour sad attempt at a twist that just managed to come out of nowhere because it didn't make narrative sense. But I could go on for hours about how objectively terrible Delia is as a character, which makes me sad because she shares names with a surprisingly well-written character I like from Buffy. It's also sad because Sarah Paulson is not a bad actress, but this is easily her very worst role, outdone only by her character in Cult, which I just refuse to even deal with. 5. Gimme sympathy. But this segues neatly into my next point, which is that the characters in general aren't particularly sympathetic. The only ones who are generally tend to be either underused, barely in the story and immediately marginalized, or written as different people depending on what a scene needs. Myrtle, unfortunately, is in the third category, producing witty bon mots and delightfulness from the actress's own charisma, and because of that managing to still make it through despite some truly awful lines unsuited to the character. There isn't really anyone to cheer for, except by default. You only really care about most of the protagonists because it's up to them to save the world. But it's admittedly a shitty world, and it's not obviously much improved by saving it from its threat. I mean, maybe we didn't see all the things that turned out better when Mallory went back and plowed into Michael with an SUV, but since it's A, American Horror Story, and B, written by Ryan Murphy, I'm just going to take a wild leap here and say it's probably not a vastly better world. This has been a significant problem with the series ever since Jessica Lange left the regular cast. She's one of the only characters anyone cares about in the Apocalypse, and she's barely in it. It's largely the actress's charisma, not the lines she delivers, with more talent and charm than they deserve. Without her, the real shortcomings of the writing become super obvious, and one of the most prominent recurring failures is the fact that there's nobody to like, nobody to truly identify with. They're all trashy, horrible people with little to recommend them. And it wasn't always like that. The character explorations in Murder House were fascinating, of flawed people who often meant well in their own way, but circumstances didn't allow that to turn out in their favor. People who were tormented by things beyond their control, and who made mistakes and suffered for them. Murder House was full of them. I have to admit, even though I didn't care much for Asylum, it also had a lot of characters who were explored and developed and mattered. Characters you as a viewer could sympathize with and care about. Characters who were redeemable and even likable, who deserved your sympathy. In Hotel, Roanoke, Cult, they're all pretty despicable and hard to like. It's a sharp change from the first 4 seasons, and not for the better. And it's a sign of bad writers when they can't help but cross the fine line between a flawed character and a horrible one. Characters being flawed can be interesting and help develop that character. But if the flaws are significant enough and they don't really add anything to the character, it usually just makes them into irredeemably awful people. And that's not what good writing is about. It's not even what horror is about. This series is a dark modern fantasy with very few elements of actual horror. But even if it were horror, even if it were really a horror series, that's not horror. That's not what horror characters are supposed to be. The main thing American Horror Story manages anymore is making its supposed heroes as bad as or worse than the obvious bad guys, who are by now pretty fucking obvious. If your high-stakes conflict has the ultimate goal of saving the world, it has to be a world that you can make seem like it's worth saving. If your heroes can't even sell that, then you don't have much hope for making your stakes believable. Don't confuse realism with verisimilitude, and don't confuse flaws for development, thinking that more is somehow better. No one's perfect. Everyone has some flaw somewhere, but flaws aren't always going to come out in a given situation. Sometimes characters should just come off as good characters and likable people. Again, don't tell us things that you're showing us the opposite of. That just makes your setting seem weaker and more inconsistent, and it makes us question things you intended us to take at face value. 6. Protect the Coven. Touching back on Coven, which formed the foundation of Apocalypse, you'd think someone would have thought to actually watch through it again, or at least read the scripts they had access to before they wrote Apocalypse. Maybe they never do, as a policy or something. It would explain a lot, since there are plot holes in every season that you could drive a Mack truck through, and inconsistencies sometimes in the same episode. As I said before, there's a weird sort of glossing over of things. It doesn't work with how the characters were established in Coven, at least to the degree that they were ever consistently established. Huge inconsistencies exist with the ending of Coven, wherein Cordelia went public with witches, and Apocalypse, which doesn't show that much more in the way of witches than Coven did. Additionally, several of the witches new to the audience are witches who are older than school age and either were already trained or needed quick training because of emergency. We never spend any real time with the larger world of witches and in general the magic able. And because I refuse to let it drop ever, how is it that Madison threatening to go public with witches is such a terrible thing at one point in Coven, and yet when Delia decides to do it at the end of Coven, it's okay? 7. Billie Dean. Billie Dean Howard. Presumably no relation to Mo Howard, though I would pay real money to see her do a Three Stooges routine with Jessica Lange and Frances Conroy. Billie is a character I like. Maybe because of all the characters Sarah Paulson has played, she's one of the consistently best performed, as well as to me being engaging. She's not a perfect person, but she clearly tries. She has problems and her life isn't particularly charmed. Billie gives you the impression that she generally attempts to do what's right and make the right choices, even though she has to deal with things that are outside the typical human experience. Even for a psychic, she's caught up in some serious shit. But how Billie really factors in here is this. Billie has never been wrong about anything this important, so why are we clearly supposed to believe that another Antichrist child has been born at the end of the season? Neither of the parents was demonic or spectral, and with the apocalyptic future erased, they also had never been exposed to anything supernatural. I'll admit that, like with the witch-warlock situation, she could have been wrong. But why would she be wrong the one time it mattered? It comes off as flimsy writing, and it's just another thing that gives the finger to Murder House, as if Apocalypse didn't already do that enough. 8. Cheap and common. Previous seasons are completely devalued by their inclusion in Apocalypse. Murder House is constantly marginalized, and the characters writing in it made worthless. Every struggle in Murder House is turned into a punchline, and all of their accomplishments, everything they did, was made inconsequential. Admittedly, the domestic issues of a house full of ghosts don't really matter a whole hell of a lot when the whole world has gone to shit. But at the same time, that was the first season. You can up the stakes and the scope of a story without demolishing the importance of things that went before. It just takes a solid writing ability and a respect for the characters, neither of which has been seen for some time in American Horror Story. The problems of the first season, arguably the most coherent and well-written season, are solved by retcons and bullshittery in a single episode. I'm glad that Madison had her time to shine, but really? Tate and Violet being at odds by the end of Murder House's plot was how it should have ended. That was appropriate. I can say that the story overstayed its welcome slightly, but the end of it was satisfying, and it did suit the story that came before it. Tate was an extremely complex person, and Violet was a teenager who hadn't really figured out herself or the world she lived in. Even if you were to give Apocalypse a concession, this shouldn't be it. Tate still did horrible things. He's not a good person, but he may not be irredeemable. He's not really the devil, as they kept trying to paint him as during that season. You can still think you might take care of him, and he might become a better person for the right reason. But Violet made the right choice at the end of Murder House. She couldn't deal with a relationship like that, and she shouldn't be blamed for that. It was a mature decision that made sense. To say that Tate wasn't really bad is just terrible retroactive continuity that doesn't even make sense with what was written. It cheapens everything and everyone, takes away the real threat of the story, and makes the whole thing a worthless gesture. But more than that, it also reflects a pretty facile worldview. People aren't generally all good or all bad. Good and evil tend to be abstractions that reflect extremes, and very few people are really consummately one or the other. That's why Tate was so appealing. He was a bad boy, but you could also believe that he really cared. Maybe he really did have the capacity for love, and it was profound, but he also had done terrible things. At the time, they presented him as the devil, essentially. Extremely charismatic, but probably not good to be around. And Evan Peters portrayed him beautifully, and perfectly as he was conceived. You want to comfort him, but you know better. And as the viewer, you become a part of the character's world and know more than anyone else involved, so you feel even worse, probably rightly, for finding sympathy or even desire for him. That's how you do a complex character well. Compare and contrast with Cody Fern's awkward, ridiculous Michael to see how you do a character poorly that should have been complex, should have been full of nuance and levels of complexity. 9. Where the fuck is Kyle? Just that. Where the fuck is he? Someone who doesn't really die is a huge advantage in this fight. It's a little odd to me that so many of the people brought back to life also don't have any of the drawbacks to that which was shown in Coven as being part of the process. Madison has after effects that become a prominent part of the story, at least for the episode or two they remember that plot point exists. Regardless, Kyle is completely missing from the series, and to have been such a huge part of Coven, it is a remarkable oversight. Remarkably stupid, mainly, because as their new butler and bodyguard, he would have been there to help stop Michael and his cohorts. At the very least, they should have given him a moment to try and fail if they were going to throw him under the plot bus, but they didn't even give him a single appearance. And it's not because they didn't have Evan Peters around. He played more characters in Apocalypse than he'd ever played in a single season before. What's one more? Especially considering Kyle's nature, there's absolutely no excuse for his omission. It's just sloppy and lazy because clearly the writers didn't want to deal with the complication that he would add to the story. And probably because they thought that having a male character around would undermine their flimsy attempts at girl power, despite the fact that he was their manservant and they had had Spaulding before. But I guess they have a point if that's what they thought, because Kyle was sympathetic and his story was tragic and some of the witches were at least sensitive enough to care about his plight. Apocalypse seemed more concerned with women versus men and vice versa, and clearly the writers didn't imagine the viewers to be intelligent enough to deal with any exception of note. It's a huge missed opportunity too, because quite frankly, Kyle would have been an interesting foil to Meade. They would have occupied similar enough circumstances, and seeing the two duke it out to find out who was tougher, Patchwork Revenant or Satanic Android, would have been much too exciting for American Horror Story. 10. Not cooperating. Why are the cooperatives so important now when they've never been even hinted at before? Couldn't they have brought in, the stupid clown cult at least? Or whatever form that giant turd has taken? At least it would have been something that had already been established in the world they were so desperate to link together as a singular setting. It's a little conspicuous to try way too hard for years to make us think that all these stories have something to do with each other, then to ignore or undermine huge aspects of that. Like, previous seasons went into really suspicious coincidence territory to tie things together and have callbacks. They were really trying it hardcore, to the point where it would stand out in the story, or everything would grind to a halt so that they could do a lame callback nobody was asking for. The cooperative being suddenly relevant isn't the only time Apocalypse did this, but it's not any more acceptable. Either we're supposed to believe that the every season before now was building up to this, or you honestly admit you just pulled it all out of your ass as you went. You cannot have it both ways. 11. Calling all occupants of interplanetary craft. The aliens, who were a huge part of Asylum, Season 2, were implied in the promos, and when the Carpenter's eccentric classic Calling All Occupants of Interplanetary Craft featured prominently early on, a lot was made over it. It's far too obvious to be anything subtle, but it also isn't something that ends up being Chekhov's gun. Nothing comes of it, and it just ends up looking stupid. Why even focus on a scene that amounts to nothing? It didn't even develop any of the characters involved. It just made it seem very questionable for the show to take such inordinate time to focus on something so meaningless. As I've said before, I wasn't a huge fan of Asylum, but the aliens were one of the more interesting and still mysterious aspects of American Horror Story. There were so many unaddressed questions and plot points from Asylum, and the aliens continue to be the most mysterious of all. Why indicate that you're going to bring them in and then do no such thing? It was a huge letdown, especially considering virtually nothing tied back to Asylum. Not even Lana Winters, who had already appeared multiple times at the present, was deemed worthy of a mention. 12. Dress code violations. Okay, there's no polite way to say this, but there's absolutely no reason why people in Outpost 3 are required to dress any certain way, and likewise no reason why the Hawthorne School requires uniforms. It's as stupid as if Miss Robichaux still gave a fuck about that. Who cares? Most everyone involved is a legal adult, or it's after the apocalypse and it doesn't fucking matter. Uniforms are supposed to be for utility and pragmatism, but in every one of these cases they just seem like pointless refusal to let go of something that has no practical use, even in the story. Incidentally, it's also incredibly stupid that everyone at the outpost just decides sure, Venable and Meade are A-OK to be in charge, even though they've obviously only decided this themselves arbitrarily, and it's strangely unchallenged in any meaningful way. People are just like, yeah, okay, that makes sense. We'll let the help we paid $100,000 for tell us we can't have sex for some reason. Coco gets physically abused for even having an understandable problem with the way they run things, and strangely, nobody does anything about it. Venable and Meade attempt to make them into cannibals without letting them know, I might add, yet the only one who really meaningfully has any reaction to this is, again, Coco. As extra as she's written and as extra as she is basically all the time, she still manages to be one of the only characters with any capacity for rational thought or believable response to any situation. 13. Horror does not mean unsatisfying. It does not mean the same thing. Something being unsatisfying does not make it horror. Horror does not have to be unsatisfying. In fact, a lot of horror has a satisfying resolution. American Horror Story tends to throw in things just to try and make a story less satisfying, and usually less fitting, and it just comes off like Ryan Murphy equates these things that are not the same. You can have a satisfying, even a fulfilling story in horror. You can have a happy ending. You can have any number of things that generally poor writers think you can't have in any genre. Horror is especially full of people who shouldn't be writing horror, because over the years it became equated, unfortunately, with poor writing and cheap production. There's also an especially unfortunate tendency in recent years for shows and movies to think they're horror, but they're really dark fantasy, and no, you can't just blur the lines and hand-wave it as if it means the same thing. Throwing in character deaths, leaving plot lines unresolved, or even just sabotaging fulfillment by making it less satisfying in an arbitrary way, these things do not make for good horror. They're transparent and frustrating, and they just serve to make your already lacking story intolerable. Certainly not something anyone would choose to revisit after they'd made the mistake of seeing it once. If you really want to do something somewhere in between dark fantasy and horror, look to Dario Argento's classic film Suspiria. It's a story structured much like a classic fairy tale, and it involves some fantastical elements. It's also a story of horror and violence, and it brings a fairly childlike, almost innocent premise into a much more adult presentation. Suspiria is a simple narrative, but it's pretty fulfilling too. It doesn't tie up every storyline neatly, and it doesn't try to salvage every character. However, it also doesn't throw away every character to serve a needless body count, and it doesn't overstay its welcome. The ending is strange and somewhat abrupt, but fitting, and overall the experience is deeply satisfying. It is, in every way that it can be, an ideal horror experience that also appeals to my love of dark fantasy. And it is still horror, and it is still good at what it does. There you go, Murphy. That's all you have to do. Watch Suspiria and learn from it. Maybe change a few names. I mean, you watched Fulci's The Beyond and nonsensically tossed elements from that into Coven. Why stop there? So there you have it. 13 points from Apocalypse. Though I should have just gone for 10, since that's how many they run now. American Horror Story, you let me down. You let me down hard. Will they be able to save it with next season, where we've been promised another Return of the Witches? No, they won't. They fucked it up twice and fucked it up massively. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, I obviously have no shame left because I'm still watching American Horror Story. This has been Hushcho. If you enjoy what I do, support me on Patreon, follow me on social media. I'll see you next time. You're welcome. Bye.